Okay, C. Derick Varn, longtime Marxist commentator, personality, vlogger, host of the Varn Vlog, and a constant comrade of the This Is Revolution crew. Uh, I'm talking with you today about Marx's writings with Engels about Ireland and the Irish question. Uh, it's a volume that I've just reissued and published, and I was interested in what your take is. First, let's begin with understanding this is a volume that was originally published by Moscow's Progress Publishers, the Kremlin's propaganda wing. So, what do you know about how the Kremlin approached and kind of curated Marx and Engels in these issues?
Well, they actually did a bunch of these readers on various national liberation questions, and it did seem to be partly driven by the pivot in the post-Khrushchev years to national liberation as a means of expanding their foreign policy. Um, but I will also say that some of the most clear statements on Marx and Engels journalism, their statements on immigration, the really some of the things that the only things you really learn about settler colonialism and Marx and Engels come out of the Ireland and the Irish Christians writings. The other place you would find some of this stuff would be their collected works on the U.S. Civil War, and then you're going to be looking at smatterings of journalism on China, like the Taiping rebellion, etc. Um, so, you know, uh, they weren't. These writings were not initially published together. It's something to remember when you read this collection. But the Progress Publishers book was pretty decent. In the early aughts, I was like going from used bookshop to used bookshop to try to find these things because you could find them still back then for fairly cheap. And while it was definitely Soviet propaganda, they were some places at the time where the only easy place to find these writings in a way that put them together. Um, Back then you could also go to the Marxist Internet Archive before the intellectual copyright disputes had them take a lot of this stuff down, but they weren't all clustered together like this. And even when you went to the Marxist Internet Archive, I believe you found a scan of the Progress Publishers book anyway. So, um, so it was not without its own ideological reasons for being published. I think Marx and Engels on the Irish question is where their stances towards national liberation are probably the most coherent. I mean, the other writings on like Serbian nationalism and Polish nationalism are a little bit more arcane to us. They're harder for us to contextualize, and I guess you can find a few other pieces by them, and like Marx's ethnological notebooks late in his life. But in general, this was something that they were pretty well informed of, and I think this is actually important to remember that Marx is writing these while in England, where a lot of the other stuff he's writing, like his encyclopedia entry on Simon Bolivar, his stuff on the U.S. Civil War, I like a lot of that stuff, but it's based on secondary correspondence at best. Whereas he's actually dealing with Irish, like he's dealing with Irish workers in Britain at the time. So it is a much more, it's an issue where he has firsthand experience on something other than continental Europe. And I usually think that's to be considered. These as far as another piece of the Soviet response to this, though, as early as 1916, And you had people like Zinoviev writing about the collected works on Marx and the Irish question as important for like early Bolshevik national liberation policy, Lenin's policy towards nations. And I think that's important to remember, because while I do think there was a larger geopolitical context for the publications in the 50s, it's pretty clear to me that the Bolsheviks have been interested in this all the way back to before their own revolution. So it's part of what inspired the Lenin's nationalities policy, for good and ill, in my opinion. But and the vacillations there. But it is really important to understand. And I'll stop there. I'll let you ask the next question.
That's amazing, actually, and I really appreciate. So one of the interesting controversies going on in contemporary discourse is around the topic of settler colonialism. Its most vulgar manifestation is kind of the Trumpian whiplash to the 1619 Project and all his Baroque propaganda. But also, you've got people on the left, most notably somebody from Catalyst and Jacobin just published a article about how Marx's concept of primitive accumulation isn't a basic statement of how colonialism and primitive accumulation was not slavery. So, what's your take on how these writings can help intervene in that ongoing contemporary controversy?
Oh man, I mean, one of the things I'll say on the Jacobin issue is, like, I've seen 3 different articles about history. One on slavery and primitive accumulation, slavery not being exactly a form of that. I would tell people actually look at Marx's writings in the U.S. Civil War on that, because a lot of Second International Marxists would talk about how slavery is an antique form of a political economy, and there's no way for capitalism to incorporate that. I used to believe that Marx believed that too, until I read Marx's writings in the U.S. Civil War, and he talks about this hybrid form of capitalism that pulls back from earlier forms of oppression, and lines up with the Grundrisse actually on prior forms being reincorporated into current modes of production. But on the Irish question, and specifically, this has been really important on, like, Vivek Chibber and Jacobin. I think the week we're recording this put a very controversial article about colonialism not and imperialism not preceding capitalism but postceding it. And there was a weird proxy debate about race reductionism versus class reductionism involved in that. One of the things that I think that we could really look at in regards to settler colonialism and the Irish is a kind of double move that I think David Roediger actually wrote the best about in The Wages of Whiteness. But if you compare the Irish diasporic experience in Europe versus the United States, it's actually very clarifying. And Marx gives us some indications of this, because what you see very clearly is both settler colonialism and imperial practices, including things like the foundation of the police force as separate from the sheriff and these medieval, like, tax collecting institutions that had worked as proxies for lords, that we think of as kind of police forces. The first modern police force, it's not just slave catchers. That's actually not entirely true. It's in Ireland after Cromwell. And what you see when you look at the Irish situation in particular is that we have one of the earliest forms of racialization. The prior forms of racialization of other people who would have been considered of similar ethnicity were in the Mediterranean after 1492. That was the racialization of new Christians, aka Jewish and Muslim conversos in Iberia. But the second instance that you have after that of a group that's racialized that is, you know, what we would consider white today, is the Irish.
Right.
You see a profound shift in settlerism. So early settlerism in Ireland is not new. It goes all the way back to Danish invasions, and the English had invaded and intermarried many times, as had the Scottish. But around the time of the instantiation of capitalism, and I do believe Marx is right to place the beginnings of full-blown capitalism around the English Civil War, you get a racialization of the Irish, and you get things that you're not going to see again until the South. You get massive plantations, the Ulster plantation being the biggest example. You get language bans. You get tensions between settler groups who came in with a different religion and did not intermarry. Because prior waves of settlers into Ireland had intermarried with local populations. And what you see here is the tendency that later you see in the Americas, even though this is concurrent to that, but like it really becomes developed, where if you want to explain why the United States does not look like Mexico, right? How you do that is looking at Catholic and New Spanish settlerism, which still followed a late medieval model of intermarriage, and British Protestant settlerism, which did not promote intermarriage at all.
Right.
And that shows up first in Ireland.
Right.
So you didn't actually have the creation of a settler identity that has no motivation to intermarry. Now, I don't want to romanticize the medieval Spanish thing. I mean, you know, we can talk about the casta paintings and like all the weirdness of Latin American racial thought, because it's not like it wasn't there. But the binary that we associated with particularly English Protestant settler patterns is first established in Ireland. So you get the police force, you get the establishment of settlers, you get genocidal policies and deliberately induced famines, you get stuff like residential schools. Ireland is really used as a lab,
right,
for how to best manage the populations later on. Now, what is interesting, I think the reason why David Whitaker is so interesting about this, because a lot of people will use this to say, well, the Irish weren't right. And I'm like, well, they kind of were in America, because the way the American, and to some degree the Canadian, so we'll talk about Anglo-North America here, and we don't just limit it to the United States. Identity was pivoted around whiteness, was that it could expand to accept the Irish if the Irish made active pivots away from, you know, any identification with other minority cultures, particularly other Catholic cultures, first the Spanish and the Italians, but then also making sure that they distanced themselves from being recognized as Black. You saw this with other Celtic peoples in the U.S., particularly. You saw it with the Cornish and a lot of the miners' strikes. When Black laborers were used to break them up, you saw that push a lot of Cornish workers and Manx workers who had not identified with the white Protestant population to start identifying with them. So all this really does begin in Ireland. And what is interesting is Marx is kind of aware of it. He doesn't write about it in the way that we would talk about it here, but a lot of his writings about the Irish as a necessary other for controlling the English proletariat And the battles about immigration really have been about battles between the bourgeoisie, where the English proletariat is used as a proxy because their fear of the Irish as an inferior competitor. Like, these patterns that he talks about explicitly in these Irish writings, you can see as almost like a blueprint for racial management in the United States and Canada, both by the British Empire and by the American patriots.
Gotcha. If we go into kind of the interpersonal realm, Engels, of course, had a lifelong romantic partner and comrade that was Irish, and she most notably gave him entree into the working class Irish enclaves when he was starting to write his first work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. What's your take or read on his impact and that impact upon these writings?
Well, one thing you have to like, if you've read a lot of the biographical work of Marx and Engels, particularly the stuff on journalism and how they wrote journalism, you'll actually learn that a lot of the journalism is Engels, even when it's under Marx names. It's not always true. There's like I mentioned a kind of infamous article on Simon Bolivar. I mentioned some of Marx's writings on the Taiping Rebellion, and those were actually Marx. But a lot of times you read the letters and he's asking, and Marx is asking Engels to go do the political reporting, because Engels had more connections there, and it was more in line with Engels's interest. I mean, Marx was very much interested in large movements of political economy and classes, etc. But if you read the writings on the Americas that aren't about slavery, there's the stuff about the U.S. Civil War. But if you read Engels's complaints about why it's so hard to build an American proletariat party and stuff, it is clear that Engels actually knows a little bit more about what's going on the ground. That's also true in Ireland. You're mentioning his lover. I believe we were talking about Mary Burns. And I mean, they lived together as common law partners is what we might call it today, but they refused to marry because of their communist beliefs about marriage for 20 years. There's no way that didn't influence Engels. Plus, Engels as a shop manager of a German bourgeois, small bourgeois, I don't know if it was fair to say small, mid-tier bourgeois, factory family. England definitely was more on the ground with the difficulties of Irish versus English or British labor, and why so many people were being driven from what we would now call the periphery to the core, even though it's only, in this case, a couple hundred miles separating them. Why this was happening. This would have been a very live issue for him in his life from two different directions. And I do think that's why you get, to get into some basic Marx and Engelsology, why you get statements in the manifesto about the workers of the world have no country, but they have to organize by nations, right? Like that seems paradoxical to us, but it is. He's like, ultimately the workers are all unified, but their common cultures are the only way that they're going to initially unify themselves. And this really is, I think, pretty clear in the Marx Engels writings in Ireland about why they think that has to be that way. Ultimately they think that the Irish workers are going to have more in common with the English workers, but they can't get them to organize together because they see each other as competition. And Irish liberation would be thus one way of removing a way of managing the working class by playing off of racialization as a form of market competition.
Gotcha.
And so I think it's very important to see that in terms of Ireland. And again, if you look at what happens in the United States and Canada, what happens in Ireland is where you see it first.
Right. Okay. We're in a very interesting moment politically, socially. It's been a crazy decade for a lot of people, especially, say, immigrant solidarity activists, Black Lives Matter, different formations under the regime of Trump that kind of have had to be on high alert. And um, you just mentioned something very interesting about this phrase in the manifesto. The working class has no country, but they should organize on the basis of nationality. People come into activism spaces today and they get told, you know, the most common phrase I've heard is stay in your lane. And I can understand and uh, totally respect that logic. I'm just curious, how did Marx and Engels approach these kinds of arguments and debates? Because they were overt communists coming
Mhm.
to a Catholic population that had many instances of conservative politics. They did not conform with Marx and Engels.
Absolutely. Um, One is Marx and Engels. I mean, the way they viewed religion, is that religion probably would have to ultimately be suppressed. I don't know that I actually agree with that part of Marx, but it is in there. But that most of the religious problems are actually a result of material conditions. If you fix the material conditions, most of the religious problems will go away. So they view religious conservatism amongst oppressed peoples, which I think actually is fairly true. If you look at like the African Episcopal Church versus the African Anglican Church versus the American Episcopal Church, you can see a pretty big difference there. One that I've experienced directly, even though I'm not a Christian. What I would say though is, I think this tendency is something that's interesting because they had a tolerance for it with the Irish. There were other people, and the Polish too, actually, but they
Right.
had less tolerance for it with the Slavs. And it's one of the points in Engels anyway that there seems to be some inconsistency in thinking. That he seems to reconcile this with historic and non-historic peoples, but you don't even get for sure that that the Irish are historic peoples. I actually can't remember if that's said that off the top of my head. The way they viewed this though is that most of the tensions, I mean, they say this explicitly about immigration, are a way to manage domestic proletarian populations, and it's effective. And for example, you'll have a lot of people who are soft socialist, social democrats, who are kind of nationalists, who argue about extreme border, or maybe not even extreme, even just moderate border limitations, and start taking even conciliatory stances to Trump's immigration stance. Some of them do it because of popularity, because it seems to be a popular issue. Although, again, in America today, Trump was very popular on his immigration stance until about 2 months ago, and that's not so much true now. And polls tend to lag for a few months behind actual events. So who knows if that's actually the case.
Right.
The other thing I would say is that they realized, since it was an issue of control, that one, national liberation will reduce the pressure of subject peoples coming back to the imperial core and being seen as a way to push the domestic population against the wall and then make them sympathetic to local bourgeois interest. And a lot of people will quote one of the more famous pieces on immigration by Marx, um, uh, on the Irish question. Um, in fact, I'll just read a section of it. I believe it's in your book, but this particular piece in question is: in reducing the Irish population by eviction and forcible immigration to such a small number that the English capital invested in land lease for farming, can function with security. It has the same interest in the clearing of the estates of Ireland as it has in the clearing of the agricultural districts of England and Scotland. The 6,000 to 10,000 pound absentee landlord and other Irish revenues, which at present flow annually to London, have also been taken into account. So he's saying that this is a force of enclosure that's going to expand capital, but it's also going to drive Irish workers to the core, which is going to intensify ethnic tensions, and those ethnic tensions are going to be easy for the local bourgeoisie to take advantage of. A lot of people will quote this and cut out that part and make it sound like Marx is actually advocating for immigration restrictions.
Right.
Or other people will quote it and say Marx is advocating for unlimited free trade. And it's neither case, really. What he's arguing for is that as long as the Irish and English are going to view themselves as opposed, and as long as there's material pressures forcing the Irish out, there's going to be a way for local bourgeoisie to manipulate the English population. And that does sound like he's for immigration restrictions, but the immigration restrictions also do the same thing because they intensify pressures on other sides and allow the international bourgeoisie to leverage relative value. And basically he's on to something like we see with outsourcing.
Right.
Like he's aware of that in the Irish question. So it, what do? You have a very high paid domestic population, you lock them in, you're like, capital controls. But the thing is, you throw in capital controls, you start having trouble growing markets. So what kind of capital controls do you induce? Blah, blah, blah. There is no good way, according to Marx, to constrain capital because capital has to move internationally. The national the national governments are managing it locally. That's what they do. They're a class government. That's what they're for Marx. But what this creates for them is this way to really leverage two different pressures. You lock people out, but then they're now a form of cheap labor that you can use somewhere else. You let them in, and it freaks out your domestic workforce and maybe lowers the bottom end wages. And there you go. The Marxist read is both of the standard takes in America that unlimited are relatively unlimited. There's no such thing as unlimited immigration in a capitalist country for the first point. But anyway, but relatively unlimited immigration is good because it increases demand on the market, demand for jobs. So it makes the labor supply weaker, and workers have a weaker command over wages. And at the low end of wages and skills and credentialing, that actually does seem to have some relative truth. However, limiting immigration doesn't necessarily mean, and I think we can see this today, actually, we have a very strict immigration regime in the United States, and unemployment is going up.
Right.
So it's the relationship is not one-to-one, and Marx is aware of that. And the other issue is that he's talking about is like focusing on the immigration issue is really focusing on a bourgeois issue. The national liberation of Ireland would reduce it, but again, the workers of the world ultimately have no country because the Irish national project may be worth supporting strategically and even morally, but there's still the contradiction of the Irish bourgeoisie and the Irish proletariat, and that doesn't go away with national liberation.
Right. Okay, so one of the fascinating points, and you brought up David Roediger earlier, who was part of the Sojourner Truth Collective back in the 70s and 80s, and they left a body of work that has included the writings of the late Noel Ignatieff, How the Irish Became White. One of the pamphlets Ignatieff wrote, and I think that it did have some sort of impact on Roediger, was his argument that Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, came to the United States during the pre-Civil War period, tried to get the Irish diaspora in the United States to align with the abolitionist movement, especially after people like Frederick Douglass had made an impact in Europe, and in Ireland, and the Irish Americans just vocally and viciously rejected O'Connell on the basis of white supremacy. Essentially, they were in the midst of experiencing integration and becoming white, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, meanwhile, in this volume, you have critical comments from Marx and Engels, very, very biting about O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell, who was called the liberator. What's your take on that whole dynamic at play?
Well, I mean, from the Marx and Engels standpoint, Daniel O'Connell is making a moral argument about liberation.
Right.
And there's going to be inherent, they would see that as inherently bourgeois, that it would be class collaborationist.
Gotcha.
And yet, I think that it's important to deal with, and also, like, Marx and Engels' views on race are weird.
Yeah.
I say that because I've studied it a lot recently. They basically did believe in geographic determination of national characteristics, but through intermarriage in the proletariat, that would go away. So they have something like a working class cosmic raza that they promote.
Yeah.
We would find this pretty racist today. I
Right.
mean, I will admit, when I read these parts of the Marx and Engels letters, it does make me uncomfortable.
Right.
But people will say, "Oh, well, Marx and Engels were simple racists," and I'm like, not really.
Right.
Particularly compared to like everybody else at the time. But let's just remove that. There were people who had better racial views than them.
Yeah, I would say it's reflective of preliminary and primordial anthropological and sociological sciences in the 19th century.
Absolutely. Like, they're dealing with very basic anthropology. They're trying to come up with theories about why people the way they are. They are also, Marx and Engels are dealing with genetics, both Lamarckian and Darwinian, and they have their own kind of hybrid theory that shows up in Dialectics of Nature by Engels. And also Marx has a weird obsession with soil. I know that Kohei Saito has talked a lot about it in terms of like his stuff on his stuff on growth and degrowth. But it's also weirdly important to Marx and Engels' theories about race and racial intermarriage and keeping the soil good so the people would develop better. So I would have put all that in context, but I also would say that, like, racial supremacy for Marx and Engels, they would see as backwards, because it would inhibit the ability of the races to intermarry and thus share their geographically inherited traits and, basically become better. I mean, this is where the like strange right-wing versus left-wing eugenics views of the 19th century come in. It barely plays in Marx and Engels, but it's where people later pick it up. All that said, I still think they would understand the white supremacy of the diaspora, because Marx and Engels, I mean, particularly Engels, actually, Engels talks a lot about this, about the fact that there's so much land available, and he doesn't talk about it in terms of settlerism, but it is because of settlerism, that the American proletariat is more concerned about things like cash schemes, like silver versus gold money, or whatever Henry George was going on about. And thus it was hard for them to develop a proletarian conscience, because in some ways they didn't have a proletariat yet. Because so many people could go and work the land and basically with sharecropping and other things, they are the equivalent of fairly well-off peasants or early English yeomen.
Right.
And that is going to be an inhibitor to working class consciousness. Add to that the fact that the Irish are given a chance in the United States in a way that they are not in the British Empire. They are incentivized to assimilate and take on white supremacist racial views because whiteness is being expanded back to them.
Right.
And I sometimes I think even the most tacit bourgeois cinema like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, talking about Italian immigrants and their strained relationship with the Black community, which I actually think is profound because it is often what we might call the off-white, what I often call the off-white, people like my ancestors who adopt more virulent racial supremacist views in order to be accepted as white. It's a way of overshowing.
Overcompensation.
It's a way of compensation. And then you add to that big bourgeoisie was really using desperate Black workers to break strikes and union movements. And it was very hard to build trust beyond that point. The racial tensions in America is why the union movement really doesn't get very far past the Mason-Dixon line. Like, there has never been a strong union movement in the American Southeast. And the reason why is white union leaders distrusting Black workers, but Black workers were increasingly a large part of the union. It's also a big divider in the Socialist Party of America. The Socialist Party of America, for example, largely led by German immigrants. A lot of them descendants of people came down after 1848 and were part of the revolutionary tradition and the bourgeois revolutionary tradition in America for the Union. But they didn't really know what to do with these racial issues in America. The SPA is all over the place,
right?
On race. They do, for example, fight the Klan, but they also have Klan members in their mix that they take a while to kick out. Like,
they famously says that he quit the Socialist Party because they segregated meetings in the South.
Right, exactly. So, and the successes that the labor movement had in the South was when they could get Black and white workers together. So Marx does seem to understand that these racial tensions are going to be one of the big, we might call it false consciousness, but I would think of it as material. But it's material in a real sense. Like, if you think desperate Black workers are going to come in and undersell your job, it is not totally illogical.
Right.
Even though it's against your long-term best interest, because ultimately joining with those workers will be in your best interest. But this tension, I think it comes out in the Irish question most explicitly, but I think it's one of the things that echoes through the communist movement forever. I talk about the national question being the question on which Marxism has an answer, like even back to Marx and Engels, has answers that are kind of all over the place about whether or not nationalism is a stage everyone has to go through. Is it only progressive, to break up big capitalist imperial demands? Is it never progressive? Was it progressive in the 19th century, not the 20th, like Rosa Luxemburg and some of the council communists seem to argue? You get, and these debates, like, these are old socialist debates. But if you look at the literature from left scholars in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they recapitulate these debates. Like,
we're still having this argument still on China in some sense.
Correct.
What is the nature of the Chinese revolution? Is it bourgeois and a nationalist revolution, or does it retain its communist character?
Bingo. Like, while we always talk about Stalin and Bukharin believing in socialism in one country, they had either a third international or at least a common form, which is an organization they had
right
after the abolishing of the Comintern, for most of the Soviet Union's history. BRICS in China isn't really that. It's a nationalist counter financial agreement.
Correct.
Like, I believe there's good reasons for people to support it, but don't confuse yourself. It's not anything like the Comintern.
Right.
And that debate's with us today. Debates about, there are three different Marxist answers to the national question. The Rosa Luxemburg Council Chymist answer, it's irrelevant. The Otto Bauer answer, nationalism will not be abolished. It's too deep in the way we do language, but we should not be trying to give everyone their own little nation state and make them all come together, because that just won't work. You have to have like coalitions of different ethnic groups working together. But you would have like a Serbian, I mean, because he was writing in Austria-Hungary, a Serbian Marxist party and a German Marxist party, and they would collaborate, but they would be printing and stuff in their own languages and doing agitation in their own languages. That's sort of the middle position. That's the position of the Austro-Marxist. And then there is,
and incidentally, this is the same time Friedrich Hayek is formulating his free trade theories.
Right? Yeah, it is. Funnily enough,
and so there's a little bit of overlap with Hayekian free trade theory.
Oh yeah, that's actually a good point. I haven't thought much about that. That's it.
Yeah, Quinn Slobodan is writing in his new trilogy of books about Hayek about how the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire influenced Hayekian libertarianism and free trade theory.
That's fascinating. I will pick that up. And then you have, yeah, go ahead.
Lenin. You have Lenin.
Yeah, you have Lenin, which is not even just the historical people should all have their own national forms, which should be semi-independent, not completely independent. They're like, there's levels of independence, whether or not you're like the DDR, whether or not you're an autonomous zone. It gets complicated, but it's there. And Lenin basically argues that everybody should have, should have their own polities. And the early Bolsheviks go so far as finding ways to write languages for groups so that they could be considered a nation who had not had historical written languages, so that they would meet Lenin's criterion for being a nation, and two, ethnically sorting Central Europe, which no one had managed to do, not the Nazis, not the Ottomans, not the Austro-Hungarians, not not the Holy Romans. The USSR did that.
Right.
And a lot of today, one of the biggest, particularly at the end of the Soviet Union, one of the biggest opponents of Soviet policy were these nationalist formations within Central Europe, which started pushing back Ukrainians, right. Latvians, Lithuanians, places that had not had a consistent state.
Right.
If you look at, just talk about like a person from, I don't know, Transylvania or Wallachia or any of those places. Like, look at where it's at. We'll call it, like, in the 19th century, it's going to change hands like 15 times. And also, they're probably not going to be speaking, the indigenous language. They might be speaking German, or Russian, depending. And so this is an issue that I think haunts us all, because there's not, there are downsides to every one of those answers. And like, for example, Stalin pretty much went by the Lenin view, but then there are times he didn't. He was very big on suppressing Russian nationalism, except at times where he wasn't, such as the speech he gave after the Great Patriotic War. But then people are like, oh, that led to Russification. True Russification didn't really start till after Stalin died. And in fact, there were still nationalities, like Ukrainians actually had a pretty privileged place at times in the Politburo. So
yeah, I mean, the guy who follows Stalin as a Ukrainian.
Right. Exactly. And Stalin's a Georgian. They're right. Neither one of them are Russians. So when you look at this, you're like, well, the policy's a mess. And you look at the general left, like people like Benedict Anderson, but then then it's like, okay, but what do you do with these nation states? And the last thing I think that's interesting is that we talk about the great nations today, like the multipolar nations. They're not nations by the strict definition of Marx and Engels and even Lenin. Yeah. They're multi-ethnic, plural national formations, maybe even empires. United States, not a historic nation by Marxist terms. China wouldn't be either. It's 5. Sun Yat-sen had it being 5 nations, so coalition of 5 nations. I think it's 18 under Mao that are recognized, and still that's probably true today. There's probably some other groups that have been added. India, not historically, when it is made a nation by the experience of the Raj. But even then, there's not one historical language, not one historical religion. That people don't necessarily view themselves as people, which is why Hinduism is such an important but relatively Hinduism as the way we know it today as a unifying fact of India is a relatively modern phenomenon. The religious beliefs are very old, but
all of these are multi-ethnic polities.
Correct. So they don't really meet. I mean, somebody was laughing at me because I'm like, oh, you talk about plural nationalism. I'm like, American nationalism is plural nationalistic anyway, and it's civic. Yeah, you guys make it sound like it's really hard. Even the English, the British Empire is a explicitly and legally plural nationalist project. So like,
white nationalists are only using the white nationalist element, I should say. You know, Tommy Robinson, National Front. Their emblem is just the St. George Cross, not the rest of the British flag.
Correct. So, and it also leads to weird tension. I mean, one of the interesting things about if you study the right, like I have, you'll see that like there's tensions between American white nationalists and European white nationalists, because American white nationalists are like, why don't you form a pan-European white, state? And the European nationalists are like, no, but we're French though. Fuck those Slavs. Like, sorry, excuse my language, but
no, it's fine.
But yeah, I mean, even in the case of the UK, like the hostility towards Slavic peoples versus like even people from the Commonwealth who are African would strike many Americans who are nationalist as bizarre.
Right.
So
even the Welsh get treated like shit.
Yeah, exactly. Another group that really kind of adopted whiteness hard in America, but that was cool for a lot of the Celtic groups. I mean, like I mentioned, the Cornish and the Manx. It happens to them later than the Irish, but it does happen by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century.
Right. So let's jump back in timeline wise, just to briefly talk about the Second International Marxism. We already briefly alluded to it with the terms of the Austro-Marxism. Rosa Luxemburg has her famous debate with Lenin, but I'm very interested to know what it was like in terms of how the Second International, especially Germany, looked at and responded, because it would seem that this might short circuit what ended up happening in that little inconvenience known as World War One.
Yeah. The standard position of the center of the SPD, which was represented by Kautsky, was that the workers of the world was the basic worker of the world have no country, but we have to organize nationally because those are the arms we have. And we need some place in the core. The logical place would be us, because we don't have large imperial holdings to create something like a labor aristocracy. And I don't mean that in the like late 70s Maoist sense. I mean that highly paid unions who are union workers who benefit from not just quote foreign competition, but also suppressing local less skilled proletariat. And they did make a link in the Second International to that being tied to national chauvinism. But jingoistic and chauvinistic socialists were in the SPD.
Right.
Not just in like, the obvious the people who were tangential to the SPD who joined the Freikorps and killed, the Spartacus Bund. But also there were elements of the SPD right who even argued that we needed a German empire to spread socialism. Right. That existed within the SPD.
Right.
It's kind of shocking to read it, actually. There was also the German historical school socialist, some of which had Marxian inclinations but died fascist, like Werner Sombart, but a lot of whom were the people Marx was actually making fun of when he was talking about the socialist. He was either talking about the French socialist under Louis Blanc, or he was talking about the German historical school. Mm-hmm. And so, when he has contempt for socialists, he's not talking about social democrats.
Right.
They don't really exist yet. He's talking about the predecessors to Oswald Spengler. And stuff like that. The people who ironically gave us modern monetary theory, not Oswald Spengler, but other members of the German historical school. So Marx is intervening in that situation. There were bunches of different kinds of socialists, and a lot of them do get absorbed into the SPD. So I think we tend to think of the orthodox Marxism of the Second International as represented by the leadership of the center in the SPD as the opinion throughout the organization. It was just as mixed and just as weird as the Socialist Party of America. And you have to know that to understand what happened. When it comes to the war credits, Lenin blames Kautsky for not taking a braver stance on it. What we know now from the reports from the actual meeting is Kautsky initially does not support support, nor does he oppose the war credits. He abstains in the vote. Yeah. And then he has that erased from the record so that they can present a united democratically centralist front to the public.
Right.
And he oscillates in his letters on whether or not he's supporting the war effort. He leaves the SPD, becomes part of the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party, which was anti-war. But he does write some pieces that are I don't know, maybe helping Serbian nationalism is actually a reason to support the war effort, or he does not get on the Zimmerwald left theory that both sides need to lose. Right. And that you should be aiding that. So his position is it's kind of all over the place, to be quite honest. But he was not really a German nationalist. And I guess this kind of leads us to this problem when we look at this is what are our orientations about this going to be? I mean, we talk about the 1950s. The 1950s is when Soviet foreign policy really gets into supporting stuff like Nasser and a lot of African anti-colonial movements. Right. But many of which do not declare themselves to be socialist. Some of them do, although they don't often end up socialist. But these were national liberation movements. China is one of the most interesting because it is kind of a dual pincer national liberation movement. First, it's a liberation from the Qing, who are basically a Manchu empire. Then it is a liberation from the Japanese, who are taking over Manchuria. And also it is an internal battle between the Comintern recognized party of the Kuomintang. You have to remember, the Kuomintang was chosen to represent China in the Comintern, not the Chinese Communist Party, because it wasn't seen as big enough.
Right.
And this leads to all kinds of problems, and it makes using, we talk about China as a national liberation issue, but this is really kind of a later post-New Democracy, post-Mao development. Even though they were fighting people invading their countryside. So The early Communist Party had two factions in it, one which actually argued that they were a proletarian nation, a phrase that's unfortunate because the only other people who use it are actually Mussolini and the fascist. But then there's another faction who were basically, no, we have had the revolution prematurely. We should have developed capitalism. One of these people later on gets denounced as a Trotskyist, who's really taking the fall for the alliance with Kuomintang in the Civil War. But there's a lot going on there. But when this ties back to the Irish question, I mean, I think it is not ironic that it's not just ironic, but it's not surprising that Angela Nagel became the first of the American Social Democrats to start really pushing for immigration restrictions and other things associated with nationalism, because she is of Irish origins and she had spent a lot of time in the UK. But I mean, she was in America, and ironically, which wrote a lot of this. And I think we have seen that tendency, not just with whiteness, even. There has been a tendency of second and third generation immigrants who want to assimilate to be the foot soldiers of the hegemonic power, whether it's capitalist or not. And I think, wrestling with that on the Irish question and the Irish experience of diaspora in America is really interesting, because, there are a lot of Irish people in Ireland today who are confused by Irish Americans' conservatism, sincerely. So if you understand these dynamics, you can start seeing them in other places. And, this is interesting for the history of Ireland. And I'm of a lot of descent. I'm an American mutt, but I am partially of Irish descent, in so much as that matters. And if anything, I have an irrational distrust of Protestantism. So I have been interested in this for most of my life, but I also do think we can't get past the fact that some of these attitudes that we critique in nationalism show back up even in the Irish scenario. And I don't think you can just write that off easily anyway.
Right. I mean, you just mentioned this attempt to have this immigrant or minority issue to attempt to integrate into whiteness. I remember during the lead up to last year's election, interviews on CBS with border Tejanos who were adamantly pro-Trump and actually have a impulse to report undocumented people crossing over to the Border Patrol as soon as they spot them. So one tendency we haven't really touched upon, and it's always been kind of a strange question for me, just because frankly it's hard to determine much of anything with this tendency, and it's Trotskyism. Because I'll just say at the outset, I think Trotskyism in terms of what Stalin was denouncing, and Trotskyism as what has existed in the Western world since World War II, are kind of three different things.
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
I mean, you got Leon Trotsky, and he's the founder of the Red Army and the first head of the Comintern, meaning there is an internationalism and an orientation towards working on the national question within the context of newfound communist parties, the 21 conditions, all that. And then you've got Trotskyism, as Stalin talks about, which is just basically a slur to take out his opponents. And then you've got Trotskyism in the West, which is this kind of dissident post 1945 communist revitalization effort, I guess.
Right.
So what's your view on it?
Well, one, I think we tend to to overemphasize Trotskyism in the West because it was disproportionately around academics, and so there's more academic knowledge production around Trotskyism. The other reason is the Comintern did not and the CPUSA, even though there were plenty of CPUSA academics even after the purges, they were hiding out in different places, or they were keeping their affiliation closed. They still existed. But they did not debate Trotskyists. They were actively, like calling everyone a Trotskyist. They didn't do that in America, for a variety of reasons. What I find interesting about Trotskyism, particularly in the national question, but in general, is I've talked about the two dissident forms of American communism, Maoism and Trotskyism. And how if you map out the different Trotskyist organizations and the different Maoist organizations, and people think that splitting is just a Trotskyist thing, don't know much about the history of Maoism, you will find Trotskyist organizations that side with Maoist organizations against other Maoist organizations and other Trotskyist organizations, because the only thing that's really at hand is the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. And both Maoism and Trotskyism have issues with the legitimacy of the Soviet Union, but at different times. For Trotsky, it's after 1926. For Mao, it's after 1951. But they're both skeptical of the USSR. However, both produce Soviet defensist and anti-Soviet versions. So there are groups of Trotskyists who, and both produced internationalist, nationalist, and what we might call maybe cosmopolitan or Russian Luxemburgist communist. Mm-hmm. So there's less of that in Maoism, admittedly. But so you have people who insist that, like, no, there should be no differentiation. There should be one world party. And this is even further than left communists like Bordiga. Bordiga didn't believe there was a separate path to communism, that for him there's only one. But he did believe in national liberation, and he did believe that nations should go through their periods, because in some ways he was an ultra-Leninist. So there are kinds of Trotskyists who go further than that. We should just only have the international, period. There are third worldist Trotskyists. They don't have the same theories around third worldism. None of them are going to be Jay Sakhaist. But Pabloism is a form of third worldist Trotskyist who views the development of capitalism in the West means that the primary proletariat is in the global South.
Right. To clarify, because some of these names are probably going to fly over people's heads. So we're getting into the Marxist weeds of sectarianism. Jay Sakai is the author of a famous book called Settlers that says the American working class white workers are fundamentally irredeemable and beyond any hope. Is that the fair summation?
Yeah, I mean, more or less. Yeah, they're not proletariat because there's some other stuff in there that he basically takes race and nations as proxy in the developed, because he talks about indigenous nation, not nation as if it's like kind of one and then black nation. But yeah, I would agree with that.
Pablo was a theorist who said that Trotskyists should, instead of forming their own international and their own independent new communist parties, they should try to infiltrate the old Soviet-aligned parties and try to shift opinion internally.
Right. And they thought this would be most successful in the developing world. So, like in Latin America, basically. And you do see, there's strong Trotskyist movements in Latin America.
And this was simultaneous when Cuba had its revolution. And so Guevara's Loco theory with Regis Debray was making quite impactful influence. People thought that Mao and his ideas, in some sense, mimicked Trotskyism also. Most famously, Khrushchev rather dismissively calls Mao a cave Marxist.
Yeah.
But that's another story entirely, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I would go I think though what you see is the tensions around the national question develop just as strangely in both movements.
Right.
So, and there are also movements that we can talk about their Western counterparts. The Trotskyists don't have a state after, Trotsky's exile. Now, when people are like, oh, the Trotskyists have never had a successful revolution, I was like, well, he was part of the one that was successful. In fact, he was more there than Stalin was. Stalin was in Siberia at the time.
Yeah.
But sure, I'll buy that. But the orientation around nationalism it varies by dramatically. I mean, there are people like Sam Marcy, who was a Trotskyist, who was a super Soviet defensivist, super national liberationist, and one of the biggest Marxist-Leninist parties today in America. I mean, one of them, not the biggest, but one of the biggest, probably the one that gets the most press anyway, is a descendant of a Trotskyist formation,
right,
through two splits.
Right.
First,
Party of Socialist and Liberation originally comes out of Workers' World Party, which was originally an offshoot of the Communist Party that was in defense of the Cuban Revolution.
Correct. And you also have the Kamehalites, who were kind of social democrats, but who wanted to unite the Maoists and the Trotskyists again. Like, that all this ultra leftism amongst Maoists and Trotskyists, which, Maoists and Trotskyists funny being called ultra leftist, but was getting in the way of the true goal, which is working class consolidation. So Maoists and Trotskyists should work together. That was an explicit thing in the foundation of the Green Party.
Right. Peter Camejo, as a co-founder of the Greens,
right,
the New American Party,
correct,
New American Movement.
The New American Movement, which also plays a role in the foundation of DSA. We could go into our lineages, but all this stuff, I mean, if you really want to understand the differences internally, but between Trotskyist groups, there's two things you want to look at. One, what is their belief about the Soviet Union and how they think it's going to fall? Is it the foreign worker state, bureaucratic collectivism, state capitalism, etc.? And then two, what is their stance towards national liberation? And you can explain most of the different Trotskyist parties that way. And then on the Maoist side, one, what is their stance towards China after 1982? Two, is the Chinese experience universalizable as a communist experience or not? So is protracted People's War specific to China and other similarly developed areas, or should it be done worldwide? And then three, how do you feel about the Soviet Union, and why is it a problem? Those are how you spread those out, and that leads to all kinds of weird coalitions. But I do think, again, to bring it back to the Irish question, is a lot of the issues that come up are tied into these questions that emerge in Marx's writing on Ireland, on Poland, and on China. And if you also deal with the fact that chauvinist attitudes were all over the place in socialist parties, like I said, we have examples in both the SPD, we have examples in the U.S. case. We have plenty of examples in the Italian case, like some of them became the actual core of the fascists. We have examples in the Russian case and some of the Mensheviks, particularly the Mensheviks who were willing to fight with the White Guards.
Right.
So you have this everywhere in the communist movement. But I do think Marx's insights about the way these national tensions are manipulated by capitalists, and both ways, both by trying to alleviate them by cosmopolitanism and by national restrictions. that national liberation movements actually have material interest. I mean, Marx says explicitly the liberation of the Irish nation is in the best interest of the English proletariat. These are things that are going to be debates. I mean, if you look at, like, if you go on X today, or it's probably where most of the communists are arguing, actually, or maybe if you go on TikTok, a lot the most heated debates that you have that are not tactical, like whether or not we do electoralism this way or this way, are on this national question. It is still the most live question that divides socialists, because it also divides issues on race. It comes up in proxy battles, like we mentioned, about, like, does colonialism happen before or after? And I would answer, if you look at Ireland, it happens concurrent,
right?
And you have elements before and elements after. But modern settler colonialism develops concurrently with capitalism, almost at the same time that capitalism is a fully instantiated mode of production. In England, you already have the expansion there. Right. Does it happen before? Well, there are elements of settler colonialism that exist in Ireland going back to, like, the 9th century. But what we think of as the modern, the post-Cromwell, subjugation of Ireland is pretty much concurrent with capital, and I think that's important. But it's the biggest dividing line among socialists today, and it's one that I rack my brain around. I mean, you talk about this, we're talking about Ireland, and I can be like, all gung-ho about Irish socialist history, and particularly in the way it didn't take in the Irish diaspora in America. But I can also just be like, and this is the primary trauma of Marxism, is what the hell do we do with the national question? Because if World War II is, when people say socialism or barbarism originally, they were talking, the barbarism was World War One. So, like, to contextualize that phrase, the ruin of the contending classes and a massive slaughter. The fact that the national question is the biggest dividing line in that, issue, and that even the Bolshevik, the left Marxist answer, they're not left communist, but they're, the left wing of the Second International when they come to third, has to kind of equivocate on it. Proves to me that these are some of the most important texts we deal with in Marxism, because they're about one of the most divisive topics to which there is no singular Marxist answer.
Beautiful. So that's a pretty profound statement. Now, we were just having a little bit of a chat about Marx's lineage and Marxisology, and I just wanted to bring it up to date because it actually does impact mayoral politics in New York City now.
Yeah.
So basically, in summary, what happens is there's a division in the New America movement with Peter Camejo, and one sector of it goes off to form the Green Party, and they do third party politics. Another section joins up with the rump remainders of the old Socialist Party with Michael Harrington, and they create DSA as a caucus to exist within the Democratic Party to push it to the left. And they are doing what at best could be called fusion politics if they have a ballot line that has fusion ballot line access. But at most, it's just challenging a Democratic primary for the leftmost candidate. And so that is where we get Bernie Sanders, this is where we get Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the rest of the squad, and now Z. K. Mandami as the mayor-elect of New York City. Initially, when DSA came on the scene in 2016, and remember, in its current formation, it only comes into existence the weekend after the election of Donald Trump, when there's a massive sudden spontaneous uprising, and DSA is the only outfit on the ground that's got any sort of logistical ability
Yeah.
to absorb these people.
When it jumps from like 10K. So there have been the Jacobin reading groups, which moved the DSA from like 5,000 people, which is what it had been since Reagan came to power and caused its first big boost.
Right.
And when we say electoral politics in New York, it's like the DSA has been a political caucus in New York with some force for going back to the 1980s.
Correct.
But there is, I do think I argued with someone about this because I'm like, David Dinkins was your first DSA mayor, not Zohran Mamdani. But they did well, the modern party exists after 2015. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll give you that. You have the Jacobin magazine. Bashkar sides with the DSA as kind of the left clearinghouse. They're the only people on the ground because they're backing the Sanders movement. There was another group backing the Sanders movement, the socialist alternative, but their own Trotskyist politics limited their ability to do that. And so Assault, which was looking to be one of the biggest socialist movements, basically dissolves. The DSA comes up. And I think it jumps from 10K to 30K within like 2016, and then doubles every year till it stalls out at 80K.
Yeah.
85K during COVID. Then it starts dropping down to about 65,000, and now it's back up to 85,000 in response to Trump too. And I think it is important to note a couple things. One, both splits, both the Camejo, the New America Movement split, which forms the Greens, and the DSA core that joins with the Social Democrats of America. I think that's what they were. Maybe New Social Democrats of America. I can't remember what Harrington's
Democratic
formation was
Socialist
called.
Organizing Committee. Social Democrats USA was in the Reagan administration, bizarrely enough.
Yeah. Okay. So that group, which had glommed onto a plan that Harrington had been pushing actually as far back as 1969 for a populist confrontation with socialist and in the helm of this populist movement to come and move the Democrats left. And he's writing about that as early as the McGovern campaign.
Right.
Now, what I find interesting, I'll disclose I'm technically in the DSA. Well, not technically, I guess I am. But I am of the partyist movement in the DSA. I want the DSA to break off completely and form its own party, and I don't want any of this dirty break crap. I just want it to have a program and do that. I know I'm probably not going to win. But I originally was actually in the other successor chapter of the SPA, the SPUSA. I was a fellow traveler because there was no branch in my state of Georgia,
right.
country. But I worked with them for a long time. And I find it very interesting how little effect the Socialist Party of America has had. I mean, Howie Hawkins, I guess, was the titular candidate for both them and the Greens before the last Jill Stein one when she came back. But it is a perpetual problem. It's kind of interesting about these socialist formations, because the DSA is approximately, if you adjust for the size of the population, approximately the same size as the SDS was in the late 60s.
Yeah.
I think the SDS capped out at like 50,000, but if you adjust for population size, the DSA is the same size as the CPUSA as its height. So the height of the CPUSA is in 1947, and they're about, depending on which numbers you believe, they're between 80 and 90K. And that's the Communist Party of America, for the United States, for those of you who don't know. So the DSA is the largest left formation with any socialist heritage that we've had since the collapse of the Socialist Party of America, which was actually quite large. It commanded, I think, up to like 5% of the vote, and it was big. But I say all that to say that, like, these debates can seem very abstract, but they are big debates, even in the DSA today. I mean, if you look at the arguments between, say, the Groundwork Caucus and Liberation Caucus, or Emerge, or any of the quote left caucuses, who have all kinds of various ideologies,
Oh yeah,
but are all partyist. One of the division lines is about your stance on the national question, and then also, what do you think the resulting racial politics of that stance is?
correct.
And so it does affect mayoral politics in New York. Um, uh, Arguably, it affects the mainstream of the Democratic Party, because so many of them from California were initially somewhat radical Maoists. And
Correct.
people like, what are you talking about? You sound like a Bircher. But I'm like, no, Gene Kwan, Robert Reich, all these people were associated with various Maoist movements about the national question and national development in the 70s. And so, again, it is relevant to American politics. I know it seems strange.
It's not. To explain and to make it clear for viewers, in the 1970s, National Review, or not National Review, God no, Monthly
Monthly
Review,
Review.
they were a very vibrant press, issuing a lot of internationally authored volumes from across the world, including a book by Mondami's father.
Yep,
Uh, and so they created a literary locus for these different thoughts and tendencies.
absolutely. Uh, Monthly Review ran so Monthly Review crawled so Jacobin could run, maybe. But although, to be fair, the Nation magazine was initially half, like, no, was it New Republic? One of the, I can't remember. It's either New Republic or Nation actually had communists in the founding of the magazine.
It wasn't the Nation. The Nation dates back to the
Yeah,
19th century.
right. I don't think it can be the Nation. I think it's the New Republic.
Yeah.
But they're both many such cases, as they say.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that we are finally going back and looking at Marx's writings on this in a way. I mean, it was popular to look at in the 1950s and 60s, but interestingly, if you look at the late New Left, and then you look at the Gen X Marxist left, this stuff is nowhere in the discussions. Like, it's just not there. I mean, to be fair, I am a Zennial. I was born in 80. And when I entered the left after my brief stint on the paleo-conservative right, there really weren't that many Marxists at all. The only ones that I knew were British Trotskyist groups that had got American chapters by opposing the Iraq War, and then International Answer, and they weren't all even Marxist. So you had the WWP and PSL, and then you had a bunch of Trotskyists, and that was it, really. Right. I mean, the CPUSA existed
on paper.
On paper, yeah, but they had almost no members at that point, except for like Angela Davis. So I don't even know if she was still in at that point either.
It wasn't.
Yeah,
it was Gus Hall's little retirement home.
Yeah, it was a very depressing time. I mean, the SPA USA was also similarly. I mean, I think it still technically exists now, but it's like for people in their 70s or something.
Yeah.
But does it still exist? I know its press still exists.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting to hone back in. I mean, one interesting thing that you mentioned a moment ago was David Dinkins as the first DSA mayor.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, he was in DSA, but one of the contentions I've had with people over, is this DSA or is this New York politics? And I'll use the counterexample of AOC. When Jimmy Dore was doing his little publicity stunt a couple years ago around Force the Vote, and he was really like, she's betrayed her base. She betrayed her base. And I said, how many of her constituents are actually in DSA? She doesn't serve you. She doesn't serve DSA. She serves her constituents. and they were willing to put Joe Crowley in office repeatedly for many, many years. So, how much of this needs to be understood within the context of locality and perhaps national subculture politics existing within that metropolitan context as opposed to socialist politics?
Well, I would say that the DSA's first cadre candidate is probably Deacons and Mandani. AOC is not so much a cadre candidate, but I will also say this is a fundamental paradox of this. You heard DSA talking about disciplinary electeds, and I'm like, most of you can't vote for them,
right?
So how can you discipline them? Yeah. I had this response about the Graham Plattner controversies. I was like, why do I care about, why are we throwing so much political clout nationally around a primary contender in Maine as if that's going to decide the future of American working class politics, much less socialism?
Right.
And I'm just like, just because I can't vote in it, like,
we have zero impact on this guy because we don't have any stakeholding with him.
Yeah, I mean, we're not their constituents in most cases. Like, I would very much care about if there was a socialist candidate in my city here in Utah, and someone's going to try to run one. I'm sure, maybe two, because we have a new congressional district seat, which may not even come to be, but it's currently coming to be. That means that Salt Lake actually will have representation, not be divided up 6 different ways in the state. And so there'll be one Democratic House representative in the state. And I would very much care about what that constituent did. And if I was in New York, I would very much care about Mondani. But I'd also have to frame it in the context of New York politics, because localities do matter for electoralism. And I guess maybe this is something that we can tie back into the Irish question book too, because if you are seeing electoralism as your primary method, not one of many that you're using. I mean, the Bolsheviks also encouraged people to engage in electoralism. That wasn't their method for taking power. Mm-hmm. As your primary method of being a socialist, I don't see how you cannot be limited by both your constituency, which will not just be of one class, and your local and regional and national cultures. Like, when I look at what is good for the working class in North America, and when I look at what is good for the working class in New York City, that may not be the same thing in the short run. I do think it's the same thing in the long run, but in the short run, absolutely not. And that's a problem for socialist organizing.
Mm-hmm. I think it is something you've brought up previously in your talks, is the fact that we try to impose European Westminster style liberal democratic norms onto a federalist system that John Stuart Mill explicitly said, I'm designing the Westminster system to supersede the failures of American federalism.
Right. And I'd actually point out, when America exports democracy during George W. Bush administration, we exported Westminster democracy, not our French democracy. We didn't export ours. Nobody has taken our model. Yeah, the Popular Front, I'm going to do a series on my show about this. So the Popular Front versus United Front is partly on these national questions, actually, but also how you orient in a coalitional parliamentary party about electoralism. Mm-hmm. That's irrelevant to the United States, unfortunately. That's why populism seems to replace the Popular Front. But there's just, you're not going to form a coalitionary party. Like, our government was designed to have no parties, and then when it had parties, there were contestations. But then all the states individually, because they're in charge of elections, solidified their parties almost as like private entities, but that determine state voting politics and all this and that, even though they're not really governmental entities, but they are formally protected in a lot of ways. You know, the Democratic candidate, Republican candidate is going to always get on the ballot, pretty much.
Yeah. And I mean, even the best moments of the CPUSA, it's worthwhile to emphasize the Communist Party politician elected from Harlem. You remember who his predecessor was, right?
No.
Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr.
Yes. Okay, I do.
Or Junior.
Yeah.
He's Junior, for those who don't recall, famous black liberal preacher, was part of the early 20th century progressive social gospel movement. He originally was city councilman and then elevated to representative from Harlem, subject of great level of antagonism from William F. Buckley in his early years. And that was the moment where the communists inserted their candidate in a special election on a fusion ballot line in competition with the Tammany machine and the American Labor Party. So, again, I think returning to the national question, was it the CPUSA that won that election, or was it a machine in Harlem that went back many more years and had included a Baptist minister?
Yeah, probably more of column B than column A, honestly, given the CPUSA's electoral history, which is pretty bleak.
Right.
You know,
and I think that leads right back into this national question: is the way we want to forefront one as opposed to the other.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. You know, as I tell people, the only way you can control an elected is if they are subject to your party discipline, if you have party discipline, and even then, you're going to need to have the power to enforce that party discipline. If you have the constituency locally, truly, you know, people will talk about, well, you know, 10,000 people, you know, supported Mamdani in New York. And I'm like, but how many of them are DSA cadres? You know, 100,000. So you hear, okay, but then I know that you've got 100,000
campaign volunteers,
but they're not between DSA. 85 and 90,000 of them cannot be DSA, and that's assuming every single I don't know the exact size of the New York chapters, but I've been told it's about 10% of the entire organization, which would make it around between 8 and 10,000. Which I will remind people can be drowned in a bathtub in a New York borough. Like, it's not actually that many people when you think about the size of New York City.
Right. And on top of that, this was the first election where they were able to use ranked choice voting, which was, frankly speaking, a Green Party initiative many decades in the making before the DSA was able to take advantage of it.
They use ranked choice voting, matching funds, and one of the most unpopular Democratic candidates that has been ever announced. It was also backed by a Republican president. So, you know, the conditions are, how you say, pretty unique. The other DSA mayoral candidates did not fare as well in the rest of the country. We mostly saw the victory of relatively moderate Democrats. And I'm not saying that to shit on the DSA. I just think it's a fact. While I do think Mamdani was a big victory, in so much that it, like, the again, it's one of these elections where the loser won with more, but the loser lost with more votes than the last than Eric Adams won with. So you can tell how polarized and activated New York City was in response to this, which is actually a good argument for some kind of mandate. But it's a New York City mandate. Is it a DSA mandate? I don't know. And when it comes to Bernie Sanders, were most Sanders people DSA people?
God, no.
No, absolutely not. Were most Sanders people even socialists?
No.
No.
The
Right.
majority of them were New Dealer aficionados or nostalgics.
Right. And and people just very pissed off. Like, yeah, these are there are, I always talk about the myth of the Bernie bro, but there is one element of truth to it. I knew people who were like, I hate this establishment so much, and I am so screwed by it that I will vote for Bernie Sanders. But if he doesn't win, I'll vote for whoever will burn it down.
Right.
The
alleged Sanders to Trump flipper.
Right. And I don't think there's many of those, but I know at least two of them, so they do exist.
In my sense, I think a lot of that has to be understood as much as the Sanders voters who just decide not to vote during the general.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, as a person who opposed Bernie. Well, I didn't oppose them. I just didn't care in 2016. And then in 2020, voted for him for the only time I voted in a Democratic primary since the first one involved where I voted for Mike Revelle leading up to the election of Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that I voted in the general in a way that most Democrats would be disgusted by. So, so it is, that a lot of these people exist, I suppose. And I do think we have to look at these issues very, very carefully. I mean, it's the Irish question is just not, it's both super relevant to us, but it's also I think is a limit of it shows us a limit of national organization if that's where you get stuck. Mm-hmm. Because I've talked about Adam Przewalski. I have so much trouble with Polish names. Poles, please forgive me. But Przewalski, maybe Przewalski. I don't know if you said a P. That if you look at the dynamics in the nation and just do a game theoretical prediction about the way social democrats are going to end up going, they're going to liberalize and even neoliberalize by demands of their constituency, because delivering goods to the working class in the immediate term is going to preclude long-term development of working class political interest, because the immediate term political interests are going to help the local bourgeoisie. So most social democrats are actually going to end up being national developmentalist liberals for their nation over time. And the only way out of that, and this is not a way he posits, but that I see, is internationalism. But I also know, and I mean this, you can't just wave away the racial histories or the ethnic and national histories of a bunch of people just because, communism is magic or whatever. And I know that sounds contemptuous and flippant, but like, you're not going to get like Chicano Californians to completely forget about things that happened in the 1990s. You're not going to forget, you're not going to get people to get over, I mean, in the case of Ireland, unionists versus Republican stuff in Ulster. It's just not going to completely go away. And I will tell you, my personal tendency tends to be the answer by Otto Barr, that we have to accept that these things exist, but we shouldn't make our primary national formations around them, our political formations around them. That's just not going to work. But I don't have a good answer for all these questions, and I think it's a real one that we have to deal with. And it's been the bugbear of socialism now, I think, for 150 years, really. Like, and we still, I mean, like, if you look at the primary debates about nationalism, if you like, after Benedict Anderson and Hobsbawm, they are more sophisticated in academic versions of debates we had in the Second International and even in the First International. Right. That we haven't really answered these questions ever.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any further thoughts particular to the United States in terms of the way that Steve Bannon and the GOP now seeks to utilize the framework of nationalism and Christian nationalism. I mean, I know it's just basically a theological ideology and construct divorced from reality at this point, but I think it also does at least seek to plagiarize some Marxist verbiage.
Oh yeah, the Christian nationalism gives you a particularist universalism. Like you can exclude the Muslim, you can be completely incoherent on Jewish issues and anti-Semitism. And I think the next debates we're going to see on the right are going to be on whether or not Jews can be included in this project or not. Quite frankly, which have been made a live issue by Israeli nationalism, and it's brutal exterminationist ways. Right. You know, even on the right, that's a problem. But the thing is, that's a nationalism. I mean, these are nationalisms responding to other nationalisms.
Right.
Great show. Right. And I do think Christian nationalism gives you an out. Now, we know they don't totally mean it. Like, there's a weird way in which there's some policies passed by the Trump administration on immigration that don't favor Christians, that have been historically favored as immigrants to the United States. But it definitely seems to be to use a kind of left theory term, the historical imaginary that they're pushing right now, because it can be particularistic. It looks white in your history and mind, but it isn't explicitly racialist. The church is universal. And you can go from there. Now, Christian nationalism, weirdly, I mean, being revived in the sense is not new. Reagan revived it. The Birchers revived it. In the early 20th century, it actually didn't have a universally right-wing variance. If you think about Christian nationalists in the early 20th century, you have the populist leader William Jennings Bryan as one of them. You know, we don't think of him as a Christian nationalist, but he kind of was.
Right. Monkey trial.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is funny because, like, when we liberals like mythologizing American history, Bryant comes up as a good guy until you have to explain what he was doing in the Scopes monkey trial, which really messes up their narrative.
Right.
But I think there are going to be appeals to it. The thing, however, that we have benefited from is they're not actually ruling that way. I mean, like, all the populism stuff seems to be pretty. I mean, we seem to be living under neoliberalism in one country,
right?
Which is kind of the worst of all worlds. Particularly when you're also decimating your manufacturing sector, which Trump has objectively done by his tariffs because he's messed up the supply lines. He hasn't brought jobs back. He's done the opposite, and he seems to be empowering the very tech oligarchs that in his first administration he was opposed to. But nonetheless, if you got God, you can cover up a lot of shit. I think we're going to see a lot of that. And I think it also gives people kind of hope, particularly because people aren't very religiously educated. Like, religious knowledge of like Christian doctrine in the United States is actually quite low right now. So like, I can say it's whatever I want to say it is. And you know, and you're right. As people are more immiserated, I don't think it should be surprising that even though the millennials did not benefit from a lot of the economic development of the post 2007 recovery, that was a major boost in secularism. Like, that is somewhat consistent. And there's two reasons for it. One, was the association with George Bush with a kind of weirdly religious form of Christianity that has nothing to do with most Christian doctrine, and alienated a bunch of people into material conditions for the nation as a whole look to be getting better. And now that they're not, I do think you're going to see a lot of appeals to various kinds of religious thinking. And for people who don't know, I'm not even an atheist, but like or I kind of am, but it's not my concern here. But my point is that this secularization is going to be respondent to material impulses. So as things get worse here, we are likely to see weird kinds of revival movements that are historically disconnected from even traditional Christianity, but will claim its mantle. I think we're going to see a lot of that. And if you look at times where you've seen that before, burnt over district during it was, a lot of that stuff was during bad economic periods. That's when it spread. So I think it's a real issue. I don't think it will work though, because Christian identity in America is dependent on Catholics, Protestants, and Mormons not realizing that they traditionally hate each other.
Touché.
Like, so
though interestingly, there is I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Have you ever heard of the Christian Socialist newspaper?
Oh, no. I mean,
this is so I live in Providence area. Paul Buell and I are frequent email buddies, and one of the things that he's pointed up of esoteric pre-Second International or Second International era American Marxism is that the most popular periodical in the United States on the left was a newspaper called Christian Socialist. It was published nationwide. It was the largest periodical in terms of subscription rate. And in spite of everything else, it was able to cross the color line.
Oh, wow. That actually does comport to me though, too, because I think about other very powerful quasi socialist movements like the Catholic Workers Movement on the Dorothy Day. You can get a lot of people to drop a whole lot of anti socialist biases if you talk about it in terms of Dorothy Day and Thomas Morton. I actually think, this is beyond. I mean, it is related to the Irish question, because what do you do with Catholicism and Protestantism in the Irish formation? Because there is a way in which the racialization was actually based off religious distinctions.
Oh, yeah.
And I've actually said whiteness has a Christendom-shaped hole in its heart. Like it really does. Like who counts as white is often dependent on what kind of Christian you are and who's making the decision at a given time. And the whole whiteness as a category was partially as a way to justify taking possibly Christian slaves from Africa. So it is a there is a history there, and one that I will say I don't think Marxism historically has dealt very well with. We just don't really have good answers. I mean, today, if you go on and there's a phenomenon that I like to call Marxist-Leninist hyper-Christians, which is weird, because I'm like, you do realize Stalin would have probably had you shot except for 2 years during World War II.
Yeah.
So I mean, I just don't get it, but I'm noticing a lot of them. There's a lot of appeals to Christian socialism. In the Buddhist community, there's been appeals to Buddhist socialism, which is also interesting because Buddhism's been all over the place in its relationship to communism's usually hostile, although not always.
It was messy in Vietnam, to say the least.
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, theoretically, the Viet Cong and the Buddhist side of Vietnam overlap, but yeah. But it was very messy, and while all the actually existing socialist countries softened their stance on religion, every single one of them did, including the PRC.
Mm-hmm. Cuba has opened up significantly,
right? Cuba has like made forays to get, you know, less hostile to the Catholic Church.
They've allowed the Vatican to send the Pope over for meetings, and he met with Castro, and
Right.
that was huge.
That's a huge deal. So, you know, I do think like trying to secularize has been difficult, and even in the Bolshevik case, they were selective about it. They didn't really suppress certain Muslim minorities and certain Buddhist minorities all that much.
I would argue that it's an accident of history tied to Russian
France.
Orthodox anti-Semitism.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I would say that if you go honestly through the timeline up until Zinoviev declares Bolshevization for all of the communist parties, there was a much different integration. But then once you get Bolshevization and the strict militant atheism, you're dealing with an import essentially of state policy against Russian Orthodox anti Semitism that had been a state force.
Right. And for good, I mean, for understandable reasons, but I guess this also brings us back to the conflict between nations and big and multinational policies, doesn't it?
Right.
So, you know, I also I was wondering if you were going to argue if it had to do with just also French laicism, which has kind of ended up being its own particular problem because it has morphed into Catholicism without God. But
and anti-Islamophobic, anti-Muslim lunacy.
Right. And so I have tended to be maybe this is my one Anglo brainwash trait, is I tend to be a secularist in regards to the state and be like, well, we should just like leave the Christians alone as long as they don't oppose us. Like, you know, this is kind of my stance. As long as they're not enforcing class hierarchies, and I know you have to deal with gender, but there's all kinds of ways you can do that. But kind of just like, I don't know, I don't think the Amish are a problem for me. Like,
yeah,
just don't care. Like,
exactly.
Leave them be. So,
and I think that underwrites a very significant kind of neurosis almost in socialists, is they can't accept the idea that people would not be interested in a secular post-capitalist modernity that is free of religion.
Right. Right. Even if we're not suppressing religion, and even if religion still technically exists, like we're just like, it doesn't. I mean, there are ways in which I think it would still affect people's mores, but it's hard to. I think it's like a thing that it reminds me of is the debates about the use of workers' dignity in Latin America, which got a lot of like Catholic socialists and former Christian Democrats on board with like the Chilean regime, that a lot of Marxists weirdly oppose because dignity is not material. It doesn't sound material. Right.
That only came with liberation theology.
Right. So, but historically speaking, that was a tactical error. I mean, it's just like the workers' dignity stuff played well with workers. Right. It does. And you know, you can go, well, it's not materialist enough, and I'm like, you know, many things that we frame our material experiences and don't sound material when we frame them in those terms. But like, yeah, I mean, you know, I believe in class abolition. I am actually not a big believer that everything workers do should be things that we do in communism forever. But like, I also think, yeah, giving people the dignity of their position. I don't know why we'd fight against that off of some theoretical point that, you know, doesn't really come up all that much actually, except in rhetorical debates. So, but yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if we think about like, I was gonna maybe ask you, because you know, this is an area that I'm a little bit more confused on, is like, there are socialist parties in Ireland, and even the like Sinn Féin is like a nominally centrist social democratic party in actual Ireland,
Right.
not in Ulster, not in the North. But it seems like there was a pretty vibrant socialist tradition in Ireland, and that it has kind of stalled. Why do you think that is?
I
I'm
would
asking
argue
you,
that the
Anusha.
biggest issue is that Brexit has given a very significant amount of propulsion to unification in our time, which
Mm,
gives all of the momentum over to Sinn Féin as opposed to the Labour Party, because Sinn Féin is now in both sides of the border in Parliament in a significant plurality, if not majority.
okay, that makes sense.
And that actually leads to my next and kind of final wrap up question is Ireland and South Africa both really show the limitations of national liberation politics as opposed to socialist politics. Right now, the Communist Party in South Africa is on the verge of a major schism because they're breaking up the alliance with the African National Congress and contemplating running competing candidates against ANC candidates, at which point the ANC responds by saying they're going to eliminate dual membership rights, which was a constituent of the Grand Coalition to eliminate apartheid.
So basically,
So,
they're ending a popular front.
correct.
Yeah.
So we're seeing these patterns emerge again and again. You know, Sinn Féin is not a Leninist party, even though it aspired to get that cred in the 80s. It got some very, very capitalist inclined political tendencies. One of their nicknames is the Irish Real Estate Army.
Okay.
So, what's your thought on that whole development?
Well, I mean, it follows what I was saying that the analytic Marxist Piswarski predicted. And I don't love analytic Marxism exactly, but like that if you go bourgeois national development, so you're going to power your non-comprador bourgeoisie. Well, eventually, one, they're going to have to get foreign capital anyway, and two, you're empowering them. And while there might be a good reason when you have a strong outside opposition for the class contradiction to be stalled, it doesn't go away.
Right.
Like, I say this a lot. I once had this conversation with the conservative, social democratic friendly in quotation marks editor over at Unheard, used to work at Compact, so Rob Amari, and I was like, I would love to believe your class collaboration's vision of social democracy was possible, but I think the incentives of the bourgeoisie make it impossible in the long run, no matter what. That like the best you're gonna do is have like what we had during Fordism was a few years of noblesse oblige, and people are gonna like idolize that time period forever, but it wasn't going to be profitable forever the moment you had to compete in an international market. And who gets cut out first? The proletariat, period.
And I would
Right.
go as
And
far as saying Fordism wasn't even like a generalized era. It was a specific favoring of the World War II veteran
correct.
cohort.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even, I've told people it doesn't even completely go to the whole baby boom. It only really covers the first more rich half of it. It's not even a full generation long.
And black
And
vets were excluded the entire time.
right. And there are subpopulations who were never included. Correct. And so when you think about that, you just go, okay, well, that is it, that's the best we're going to do is the weird conservative aftermath of the New Deal, because that's the other thing when New Deal nostalgists is they don't actually talk about the New Deal. They have a nostalgia for the 1950s, but not racist. And then maybe if Lyndon Johnson had actually got the New Society to actually happen, because if you look at what other than the government as a backstop on employment, New Deal was not particularly radical, even as a Keynesian. Well, it wasn't Keynesian because that didn't completely exist yet, but even as a proto-Keynesian project.
Right.
Like
Norman Thomas famously said it carries out the socialist program on a stretcher.
Right. And he wasn't wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in a time period where that seems so impossible that we imagine that as socialism itself. Right. And I don't think it's just the obvious DSAers. I think there's a lot of people who, they'll say they're not New Dealers, but when they describe what they think the ideal time of the American left is, it sounds weirdly like the 1950s. This shows up in PMC critiques all the time. Or the assumption that like former labor representation in unions and big factories is, I'm like, that was a very small period of actual working development. During Marx's own day, most work was piecemeal and irregular. It was actually a big problem for the First International. And it resembled the conditions of the quote unquote precariat or the periphery or the lumpen or whatever. And I think that's a big problem, particularly for us in the national development issue. But particularly when you're pursuing this purely electorally, what other options do you have, right? Because your lever is a national or a state in the United States or provincial and somewhere else, or a municipal lever. Those are the levers you got, right?
Yeah.
Now I can bring up how sewer socialism failed all that and people are like, oh, it got this reforms. And I'm like, was any city a socialist city? No, it failed. Like Fabian socialism has the Labor Party gotten more or less socialist over time?
Yeah.
No, it failed. Like, this is not me holding them to some Varnian secret Leninist standard. This is me holding them to the standards they set out themselves.
Right.
And
socialism, I would argue, even its successes were really just drafting off of the progressive era and Teddy Roosevelt style, state infrastructure projects.
I would agree. Right. So, it's a bigger issue for us, and I do think, to bring it back to the book, but I do think these contradictions around Ireland, which in some ways, as we've talked about, haven't entirely gone away. Although, we are living at a time where I think the Irish GDP already higher than is the Irish GDP per capita already higher than the English? I think it might be. I know they're now taller.
I don't know. The greatest developments that are being marked by their social scientists are the secularization of the state over the last 25 years. Because the combination of first the pedophile crisis, then same-sex marriage and abortion rights in a kind of 1, 2, 3 process, it's turned it from one of the most conservative to one of the most liberal states in the EU.
Absolutely. We've seen somewhat similar processes actually happening in Mexico too, oddly.
Let me say, I just never imagined a Jewish president of Mexico.
No. I lived in North Mexico for many, many years, and while it's completely false that most of German descended people you meet in North Mexico are all running Nazis, that is one of the few places that I was traveling abroad where I met brown Nazis.
Wow.
Like, met them straight up, like at a cafe. So but and also as a place where like Hitler shouldn't have killed the Jews, but maybe he wasn't so bad though, was a paper I got more than once.
Yeah, that kind of fascism had its great parts.
It just had some excesses.
Yeah, and that was actually a very real current within Irish national politics in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
I know. Eamon de Valera literally went to the embassy of the Nazi German Reich and gave his condolences to the ambassador when he heard Hitler had died.
Yeah, it is a problematic part of their history, to say the least.
Yeah.
I actually find it interesting, given the amount of writing that Marx and Engels did on Ireland, and then we talked about Polish national liberation, and the way that Marxists talk about particularly Polish stuff now is there are parallels there in some ways, but then the Irish situation is kind of like the trajectory of Ireland socially has actually gone kind of very different than the trajectory of Poland. But then I don't know where Poland's going to end up. Like,
it's hard to establish how much of this is reaction still to the old communist regime and how much of it is genuine national chauvinism.
I might give a really frustrating Hegelian answer is if there's enough of the former, it eventually actually becomes the latter.
Correct.
So you have a difference in quanta becoming a difference in quality over time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, because I don't think solidarity. I take the early instances of solidarity, despite whatever Western influence was there, as to have been a sincere attempt at like some kind of workers' moderation.
Mm-hmm.
But I know where it ended up even by 1990.
Right.
So,
ironically, with help from from co-founders of DSA.
No.
You know that?
Yeah, I did. There's some the history of American the history of American anything. I mean, the American labor movement, for example, like what the AFL-CIO was doing in Chile with the trucker strike is also a sign of something else. Because it was explicitly doing
the dirty work of Kissinger.
Yeah, Kissinger's dirty work. And it's that stuff is never fun. Mm-hmm. I'm not one of these people who thinks that the CIA was like responsible for every anti-communist rebellion or anything like that. I don't think the evidence is there for a lot of that, but they do show up like flies on shit.
Yes.
So this is always something we should remember.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the one that's always just drives me crazy is Bayard Rustin is in the middle of all of it.
Oh man, yeah.
Jesus Christ. Well, C. Derick Varn, thank you again so much for your time this evening. It has been a pleasure to have you on and to have this extensive discussion about this important book. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Ending.